In the early 2010s, military shooters were at their peak, led by franchises like Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Medal of Honor. While I do like some of these games, they're all under the same umbrella for me. Mindless and fun first-person shooters. They had their differences, but they shared the same DNA. Online multiplayer reigned supreme, and the stories for 90% of these games involved a rehash of America fighting some rival country or terrorist organization. It's a pattern that repeated a surprising amount of times in the early 2010s. When you first look at Spec Ops The Line, everything from the trailers to the box art, it looks as generic as it gets. Most people would assume it's yet another game trying to take advantage of the spike in popularity that the military shooter genre had at the time. Well, as it turns out, despite looking insanely boring on the surface, Spec Ops The Line was able to separate itself from the other military shooters by having one thing that all of those games don't have: an unforgettable story. A story that was compelling but insanely dark. A story that was able to challenge the player in a way that I've never seen before. There is a lot to talk about in this game, so to not waste any more time, let's delve into the story of Spec Ops The Line. The story in Spec Ops The Line was heavily inspired by a book called The Heart of Darkness. While the main plot of the book is not important, since it's mainly a story about the horrors of imperialism, the main premise of the book is important. Basically, the idea is that every person, under specific circumstances, is capable of the most horrific things possible. Whether it's you or someone you look up to, everyone has their own heart of darkness. Spec Ops The Line has a completely different plot, but it has a similar premise. To give a basic summary of the plot, a sandstorm has completely destroyed the city of Dubai, and a man named John Conrad leads his battalion into Dubai to rescue survivors. One problem though, it's been 6 months and nobody has heard from Conrad or his battalion since. After 6 months of no radio contact, the military is able to pick up a message from Conrad explaining that the evacuation of Dubai was an absolute failure. After receiving Conrad's message, a recon team is sent into Dubai with one very simple mission: look for evidence of survivors and then leave Dubai and call for backup. The recon team is led by the playable character Captain Martin Walker and his squad mates Adams and Lugo. After spending not even 5 minutes in Dubai, it's obvious that there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. The refugees are attacking anyone on sight, corpses of the 33rd Battalion are littered all over the streets, and there's a guy over the radio talking shit throughout the whole game. Dubai is in complete chaos, and Walker is determined to figure out what's going on. The first thing I want to talk about when it comes to this game's story is the first scene in the game, which is an on-rail turret segment, which is the most cliche and unoriginal way I can think to start off a military shooter. Don't worry, we'll come back to this later. After a few minutes of mindless shooting, the helicopter then crashes, and then we flash back to the squad entering Dubai for the first time. The game does a great job at engaging the player early on because of a few things. Very early on in the mission, Walker and his squad do find survivors, except they're hostile towards Walker and his squad. This standoff ends with Walker and his squad killing the survivors. Walker justifies it as self-defense, but we're not even 20 minutes into the game and Walker is already murdering the people that he was ordered to save. And it only gets much, much worse from here. The game does a great job at putting you in Walker's shoes. In this game, the player has just as much information as Walker does, and we're learning new information about the state of Dubai at the same time as Walker. So whenever Walker makes a decision, you may not agree with him, but a lot of times you can understand why he does what he does. Early on in the game, Walker finds a dying American soldier, and before he bleeds out, he mentions that one of his squad mates is currently being captive by the refugees. Walker then immediately sets off to rescue the soldier. Adams and Lugo bring up that what they're doing is beyond their mission parameters, but Walker justifies it as doing the right thing. And I mean, is he wrong? My first thoughts were, yeah, I'd probably do the same thing. Yet as the game goes on and you learn more and more about the state of Dubai, the more you realize just how fucked up the city has gotten. Walker was going in with the impression that the city would be a dead zone, yet he finds himself in the middle of a war between the refugees and the 33rd. At the start of Chapter 3, you learn that the refugees have teamed up with the CIA to take on what's left of the 33rd. After finding the captured American soldier, he has a standoff with Walker. The player has the option to shoot the soldier or let him go, but exactly 10 seconds later, we learn that this choice didn't really matter, since if you let the soldier go and follow him down the rope, he ambushes you with reinforcements. This is the moment that hooked me right into the story. In all other military shooters where you're mindlessly shooting enemy terrorists or Nazis, in Spec Ops The Line, you're shooting Americans. Walker's squad mates call it out, yet Walker once again justifies it as self-defense. Later on, Walker arrives at a place called the Nest, where the damn 33rd is seen rounding up the refugees. And this is where one of the best parts about Spec Ops The Line really shows itself. the environmental storytelling, and little details that can be very easily overlooked. Spec Ops' environmental storytelling dates back to Chapter 1, but Chapter 3 is where I think it's the most notable. When you arrive at the nest, Walker immediately jumps to the assumption that the 33rd is rounding up civilians to execute them, and then he storms into the nest, killing as much of the 33rd as he can. As you're walking through a hallway, however, a civilian is seen running in Walker's direction, but when the civilian looks up and sees Walker coming towards her, she immediately turns around and runs back towards the 33rd soldiers. It's a small detail, but it's also an important one, since it hints that maybe the 33rd aren't the bad guys after all. And what makes this segment even more notable is that if you kill the civilian, you can continue with no issues. Meanwhile, in games like Call of Duty, killing an innocent civilian usually comes with a mission failed and a checkpoint restart. In Spec Ops: The Line, you can continue the mission no problem. And details like that are littered throughout the game. I'll talk more about this later, but for now I want to get back to the story. As Walker goes deeper and deeper into Dubai, he learns some very important things. The damn 33rd have turned on each other, and whatever side won has taken over Dubai. And secondly, the CIA has teamed up with the refugees to take on the 33rd for reasons that Walker doesn't know just yet. At this point in the game, Walker is under the impression that the 33rd have gone rogue, and that what he's doing is justified as helping people. Keep in mind that at this point in the game, we haven't even gotten to the white phosphorus scene yet, and Walker has already killed hundreds of people at this point. Yet they keep moving forward, and it's not like they can just turn around and walk out. By the time you hit Chapter 3, you're way too deep into Dubai to just turn around. Speaking of the white phosphorus scene, let's finally talk about it. In Chapter 8, Walker and his squad arrive at the gate, but it's very heavily guarded. Walker knows damn well his squad of 3 can't take on a very large enemy camp by themselves, so he instead decides to use white phosphorus to wipe out the camp. The game gives you full control over the mortar and even marks the targets for you, like this heavily armored vehicle. Yeah, fuck that car. The game even forces you to walk through the camp after the bombardment just to give you a front row seat to the chaos you just inflicted. This is where Walker learns the truth. The 33rd were not rounding up the civilians for execution, they were trying to protect them. And Walker just torched 47 innocent civilians. The same civilians that Walker claimed he was trying to save. Instead of crying or taking responsibility for the horrible atrocity you just committed, Walker immediately shifts the blame to Conrad, once again running to the excuse that their hand was forced. Even after getting a close-up look at what he's done, Walker is still convinced that the 33rd are the bad guys. This is not only the most iconic scene in the game, this is also where the game goes from offbeat to batshit insane. Now, I want to take a second and go back to the point I made earlier about this game's environmental storytelling. Spec Ops: The Line has a lot of small details that are easy to overlook, and have a lot more significance than they appear. I'm just going to take the time and list off a few. A billboard can be seen showing a family on a beach. Very shortly after, the exact same billboard can be seen, except this time the family's eyes are scratched out. Conrad's face is seen on various billboards and structures throughout the game. Very disturbing graffiti can be found on the walls. A billboard in Chapter 7 has the exact same background as this loading screen from Chapter 14. In Chapter 4, the image of a family is seen behind the line of executed 33rd soldiers, and their eyes are scratched out, as if they're reacting to the execution of the soldiers. Stuff like this is seen throughout the game, but after the scene with the white phosphorus, these disturbing details become a lot more frequent. In Chapter 9, Adams and Lugo's name can be found on the memorial wall, despite both of them being alive at that point in the game. Also in Chapter 9, you rappel down the side of a building with reflective windows. However, on the way down, you can see the reflection of a hanging man in the window. It's seen on the left window, the same window that Lugo descends past. At 2 separate points in the game, Walker has hallucinations of his squadmates replacing enemy soldiers. In Chapter 8, you can find a tree, alive and well with green leaves, yet when you walk past the tree and look behind you, the tree is dead. In Chapter 11, if you let Riggs burn to death, you walk past a truck with the image of a man's face burning, and when you arrive at the mall, the statues by the entrance are molten rock. If you stare at the statues long enough, they will eventually return to their normal positions. However, if you shoot Riggs instead of letting him burn, the image on the truck shows a man with a gunshot wound to the head, and when you arrive at the mall, one statue is pointing a finger gun at the other. Not only do you have the game throwing very disturbing Easter eggs at you, even the loading screens start to become hostile. At first, the loading screens just give basic gameplay tips, but as the game goes on, they get much more disturbing. Just to name a few examples, do you feel like a hero yet? You're still a good person. The US military does not condone the killing of unarmed combatants, but this isn't real, so why should you care? Collateral damage can be justified. If the gain outweighs the cost, how much do you think Adams and Lugo are worth? Also, this last loading screen was apparently cut from the game, and I can see why because it's probably the most fucked up one. White phosphorus is a common allotrope used in your slaughter at the gate. It can set fire to soldiers and the innocent civilians they're trying to help. Another great detail in Spec Ops The Line is the combat dialogue and executions. Early on, Walker's combat dialogue is very simple, yet as the game goes on, Walker slowly becomes much more vicious and aggressive.
Kill the tank on the hallway! Take him out! Alright! Drop that shotgunner! I need him dead! Put down that goddamn shotgunner! Yeah, fuck you.
The same thing applies to Walker's executions. Early on, his executions are basic, just one-tapping the guy or punching him in the face once, but by the time you reach Chapter 13, Walker is now shoving the barrel of his gun down the throats of the enemy soldiers. It's not just Walker either. Adams and Lugo also become much more hostile towards Walker as the game goes on. Lugo, for example, is the comic relief character, but by the time you reach the third act, Lugo becomes the most hostile and resentful person in the group. Now with all that said, let's quickly double back to the story. Walker eventually finds Commander Rigg, who is the only CIA member left alive in Dubai. Walker helps Rigg storm a 33rd compound which houses a massive supply of water. Remember that Walker still thinks that the damn 33rd are the bad guys here, so whatever hurts the 33rd, Walker's on board with. There's one problem though. Commander Rigg is not trying to steal the water, his mission was to destroy it. It turns out that when Conrad tried to evacuate Dubai, something went horribly wrong and it resulted in the deaths of 1,300 people. If the news of Conrad's failed evacuation ever got out, it would start a war between the Middle East and the United States. And it was Commander Rigg's mission to ensure that the truth of Conrad's failed evacuation stayed in Dubai, and with the help of Walker, his mission was a success. Now, all the drinking water in Dubai is gone and everybody in the city will be dead within a matter of days. Great job, Walker. Shortly after that's done, Walker and his squad eventually find the radio man who was talking shit throughout the whole game. Lugo is more than happy to see him. Walker then uses his radio to order an evacuation of Dubai, which is kind of hilarious all things considered. The 33rd eventually storm the compound and Walker and his squad flee the tower in a helicopter. This is where the game comes full circle and we replay that turret segment from the beginning of the game. Except this time, something is different.
Wait, this isn't right!
Well, it's too late now!
No, I mean, we did this already!
What do you mean?
Fuck it! It's nothing! Just shoot these fucking guys!
You got it!
This is a very small detail, but it changes everything about the story. Walker directly calling out that you've done this before may be seen as an Easter egg, a simple wink wink nudge nudge to the audience, but it's not. The turret segment at the beginning of the game was Walker's last moments alive, because Walker and his squad actually died in that helicopter crash. Now that turret segment at the beginning of the game has a much darker meaning behind it. Everything after the turret segment at the beginning of the game is all in Walker's head. Through the first 12 chapters of the game, you are reliving Walker's final hours, as well as the decisions that he made and the consequences that came with them. As insane as that sounds, it actually explains a lot of the weird things that Walker's been seeing. Conrad's face on the billboards, or the very disturbing graffiti, or the statues from Chapter 9. All these very confusing details make a lot more sense when you realize that the first 12 chapters of the game is Walker reliving the moments before his death, like his own personal purgatory. Now, with that on the table, there's still one problem though. The helicopter crash that killed Walker and his squad took place in Chapter 12, however there are 15 chapters in the game. So if Walker dies in Chapter 12 and everything before that is us reliving Walker's final hours, then what is the meaning of the last 3 chapters? This question is actually easy to answer since the game spells it out for you.
Welcome to hell, Walker. We've been waiting for you.
Yeah, Walker is in hell. An interview with the lead writer of Spec Ops The Line, Walt Williams, pretty much confirms this. Williams said in an interview that whenever the game does a normal transition, it fades to black, but whenever Walker's hallucinating, the scene fades to white. And you want to know the first scene where it transitions to white? The very beginning of the game when you take control of Walker for the first time. Now with all that finally said, let's quickly talk about the ending. Adams and Walker storm the Burj Khalifa but end up surrounded by the 33rd. Walker wants to surrender, but Adams instead wants to go out in a blaze of glory. Adams shoves Walker over the barricade, and Walker then storms towards the tower. Inside the tower, you see the last remaining members of the 33rd surrendering to you, despite the fact that they had you completely surrounded not even 5 minutes earlier. Walker asks one of the soldiers where Conrad is, and he replies,
Where he's always been. Upstairs, waiting for you.
Walker then takes the elevator to the top of the tower, and then he learns yet another terrible truth. Conrad has been dead the whole time. In fact, he was dead well before you arrived in Dubai. Conrad talking to you over the radio was Walker's hallucinations. Walker could not live with what happened at the gate, so he instead shifted the blame to Conrad. However, after learning that Conrad is dead, Walker must be faced with the fact that everything that happened in Dubai was his fault. Walker is then given a decision to either shoot himself and accept responsibility, or shoot Conrad. Shooting yourself is the only right answer, but I will take a second to talk about the other endings. If you shoot Conrad, he mentions to Walker that after everything that happened, he can still go home. Walker then hallucinates a 33rd soldier behind him asking him for orders, but when Walker turns around, the man is gone. In the next scene, after some time has passed, Walker is seen wearing Conrad's jacket, and what appears to be a rescue squad drives up to Walker and tells him to drop his gun. This comes with 3 possible endings. Walker fights the soldiers and dies, Walker fights the soldiers and lives, officially taking rule over Dubai, or the final choice, where Walker surrenders and goes with the soldiers. While driving away in the car, a soldier asks Walker how he survived all this, and he responds,
Who said I did?
This is not only a reference to the very severe PTSD that Walker has developed, but it's also meant very literally, because as the vehicles are driving away, the screen fades to white, implying that Walker is once again hallucinating. That concludes the story of Spec Ops: The Line. However, before the video ends, there's a few more things I want to say. Spec Ops: The Line has probably the best narrative in any video game I have ever played. It has the box art and appearance of a bland military shooter, yet has the story and atmosphere of a fucking horror game. Everything from the cliche turret segment to the boring box art, all of it is there to trick you into thinking that you're playing yet another shallow third-person shooter, just to blindside you with a PTSD simulator that puts most horror games to shame. Spec Ops: The Line is a game that can never be replicated. It's one of those rare stories that sticks with you, not only because it's well written, but because it was told in a way that's never been done before. While games like The Walking Dead or The Last of Us tell a compelling story about relationships and protecting what you love at all costs, Spec Ops: The Line tells a story that is almost the exact opposite. In Spec Ops: The Line, you're the villain. Not only are you the villain, as the game goes on, it's almost like Walker is trying to outdo his previous act of carnage. The game gets more and more fucked up the more you play, but that's what makes it so compelling, because the gameplay certainly wasn't going to get people to stay. The creativity in this game's story is what separates it from all the other narrative games out there, and hopefully I was able to give this game its due praise. Thank you for sticking around this long, and I'll see you in the next one.